The courtroom is silent, save for the ragged breathing of the man kneeling on the stone floor. His hands tremble, bound by coarse rope, as the inquisitor's shadow looms over him. The air is thick with the scent of burning wax and something darker, fear. Confess, the voice demands, cold and unyielding. Admit your heresy, and your soul may yet be spared. But what if this moment isn't just about faith? What if the trial itself is a mask for something far more sinister? For centuries, the Spanish Inquisition has been remembered as a ruthless machine of religious purity, a dark chapter where heresy was hunted with fire and sword. But beneath the surface of piety and punishment, there were other forces at work: political schemes, financial greed, and power plays that twisted the Inquisition into something even more terrifying. This wasn't just about saving souls, it was about control. Imagine living in a world where a whispered accusation could turn your neighbors against you, where the very people who claimed to protect your spirit were secretly profiting from your suffering. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't merely a religious institution, it was a weapon wielded by kings and courtiers to silence enemies, seize wealth, and consolidate power. Behind every trial, every confession torn under torture, there were hidden agendas at play. Some sought to crush rival factions, others lined their pockets with the confiscated property of the condemned. And at the heart of it all, the Inquisition became a tool to reshape society itself under the guise of divine justice. Today, we're pulling back the veil on one of history's most infamous institutions. We'll follow the money, trace the political alliances, and uncover the shocking truths that textbooks often overlook. Because the real story of the Spanish Inquisition isn't just about faith or fanaticism. It's about how fear can be manufactured, how power corrupts, and how even the noblest ideals can be twisted into instruments of oppression. By the time we're done, you'll see this dark period in a whole new light, and you might just start questioning what other hidden agendas lie buried in the shadows of history. Ready to step inside the interrogator's chamber, let's begin. The year was 1478 when King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile signed the papal decree that would birth the Spanish Inquisition. On the surface, it was framed as a holy mission, a sacred duty to root out heresy and protect the Catholic faith. But peel back that gilded veneer and you'll find a far more calculated design. This wasn't just about religion, it was about unification. Spain at the time was a fractured kingdom, a patchwork of regions with competing loyalties, and the monarchs knew that faith could be the glue to bind them together. By targeting conversos, Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity accused of secretly practicing their old religions, they created a common enemy, a threat that would rally the people behind the crown. Yet the political chess moves ran even deeper. The Inquisition answered directly to the monarchy, bypassing the usual church authorities in Rome. This gave Ferdinand and Isabella unprecedented control over their subjects, a way to sideline rebellious nobles and wealthy rivals under the pretense of religious investigation. And let's talk about wealth, because confiscation was the Inquisition's open secret. Every person convicted of heresy saw their property seized by the crown, filling royal coffers while stripping power from families who might challenge the throne. The trials became a self-sustaining machine. The more accused, the more gold flowed in, funding further expansions of the Inquisition's reach. But perhaps most chilling was how the monarchs weaponized fear itself. By making the Inquisition's processes shrouded in secrecy, anonymous denunciations, closed-door interrogations, public autos da fe where the condemned were paraded before roaring crowds, they turned suspicion into a cultural force. Neighbors spied on neighbors, not just out of piety, but because accusations offered protection or, worse, opportunity. The Inquisition didn't just punish heresy. It reshaped society into one where obedience to the crown was the only safe path. And with every crack of the whip, every plume of smoke from the execution pyres, Ferdinand and Isabella's grip on Spain grew tighter. What began as a tool for unity became a blueprint for control, proving that the most effective power isn't just wielded through force, it's embedded in the very fabric of daily life. The Inquisition wasn't merely a court, it was a warning echoing through the streets: step out of line and the system would swallow you whole. Pope Sixtus IV saw the danger before anyone else. When King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella first requested his blessing to establish the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, the pontiff didn't immediately hand over the keys to the kingdom. Instead, he hesitated, a rare moment of pushback against monarchs who were used to getting their way. His concerns weren't just bureaucratic, they struck at the heart of who should wield ultimate power over matters of faith. For centuries, heresy trials had been the domain of the Church, overseen by bishops and answered to Rome. But Ferdinand and Isabella's proposal flipped that ancient order on its head. They demanded control not just over who would stand trial, but over the inquisitors themselves, handpicked by the crown and loyal to Spain, not the Vatican. Sixtus's resistance wasn't purely principled, it was also deeply practical. He understood that granting the monarchy this authority would set a dangerous precedent, eroding papal influence in one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. Rumors swirled that the Pope even tried to slow-walk the process, sending cautious letters urging moderation, but pressure mounted. Ferdinand, ever the strategist, played his cards carefully. He hinted at withdrawing military support for papal interests in Italy, a not-so-subtle reminder of how much Rome relied on Spanish might. Meanwhile, Isabella's fervent public stance as a defender of the faith made dissent politically risky. In the end, Sixtus caved, issuing the Papal Bull that authorized the Inquisition, but with a twist. The document, titled Exigit Censoris Devotionis Effectus, included a clause often overlooked in history books: the right to appeal verdicts directly to Rome. It was Sixtus's last-ditch effort to retain some oversight, a loophole he hoped would prevent the worst excesses, but Ferdinand and Isabella had no intention of honoring it. They simply ignored the provision, stacking the courts with loyalists and cutting off avenues for external intervention. Within months, the first Grand Inquisitor, Tomás de Torquemada, began his work, and the Vatican's influence over the process evaporated. This quiet power struggle reveals a truth far more explosive than the burnings and tortures that followed. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't just a conflict between believers and heretics. It was a showdown between throne and altar, a test of whether earthly kings could command the machinery of divine judgment. And in that battle, the monarchy won decisively. Sixtus's grudging approval became a blueprint for how rulers could exploit religious fervor for political ends, a lesson future empires would study closely. By the time the Pope realized his mistake, it was too late. The Inquisition had become a Spanish institution, answering to no one but the crown, and its targets would soon learn that even the Vatican couldn't save them. The streets of Seville buzzed with whispered names in the late 15th century, names like Diego de Suzan, a wealthy merchant, or Maria Gonzalez, a silk trader's wife. On the surface, they were devout Christians attending Mass and crossing themselves with pious fervor. But in the eyes of the Inquisition, they carried an invisible stain. They were conversos, descendants of Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under threat of exile or worse. And now they stood at the center of a perfect storm where religion, envy, and greed collided under the banner of holy justice. Why target conversos? Officially, the Inquisition claimed it was rooting out crypto-Judaism, the suspicion that these converts still practiced their old faith in secret. But the reality was far messier. Many conversos had thrived under Christian rule, rising to prominence as doctors, financiers, and artisans, positions that fueled resentment among their so-called old Christian neighbors. When a converso merchant's stall outshone a rival's, or a Jewish-descended moneylender foreclosed on a debt, grudges festered. the Inquisition didn't just expose heresy, it offered a sanctioned outlet for vengeance. A single anonymous accusation could drag a family into the tribunal's clutches, where the burden of proof lay not on the accuser but the accused. Confiscation was the engine that kept the machine running. Convicted conversos saw their homes, land, and businesses seized, assets that often ended up in the hands of local elites or the crown itself. In Valencia, records show that nearly 40% of the Inquisition's early cases targeted conversos, with their wealth redistributed to fund everything from royal wars to cathedral renovations. The system incentivized predation. The more property seized, the more the Inquisition could expand its operations. But the most insidious weapon was doubt itself. Even sincere converts found their faith perpetually questioned. Did they avoid pork out of habit or heresy? Was fasting on Yom Kippur a lingering tradition or an act of rebellion? The rules shifted constantly, ensuring no converso could ever truly prove their loyalty. This uncertainty bred terror, a terror that kept entire communities in line, too afraid to speak out lest they be next. By the 1500s, the message was clear: assimilation wasn't protection, it was a trap. The Inquisition didn't just punish belief, it manufactured a permanent underclass where ancestry alone could mark you for ruin. And in doing so, it revealed the darkest truth of all: that faith was never the real crime. Power was. The stain of heresy wasn't just a mark on one's soul, it became a birthright passed down through bloodlines like a curse. By the mid-1500s, Spain had codified this obsession into law with limpieza de sangre, statutes of blood purity that turned ancestry into a prison. On paper, these laws claimed to safeguard the faith by barring anyone with Jewish or Muslim heritage from holding public office, entering universities, or joining prestigious guilds. But dig deeper and you'll find a chilling truth: the Inquisition didn't just enforce these rules, it helped invent them. Suddenly, it wasn't enough to be Christian. You had to prove it through exhaustive genealogies, witness testimonies, and humiliating interrogations. Families paid scribes to scour church records for evidence of untainted lineage, while others bribed officials to lose inconvenient documents. The irony was grotesque. Even descendants of conversos who had embraced Catholicism for generations found themselves locked out of society, their loyalty perpetually suspect. The Inquisition's records became the ultimate weapon. A single ancestor's trial from decades earlier could doom entire future generations to second-class status. This wasn't just discrimination, it was a caste system disguised as divinity. Take the case of Dr. Juan Gonzalez, a physician in Toledo whose skills earned him respect until a rival uncovered his great-grandmother's confession to the Inquisition in 1492. Overnight, he lost his license, his patience, and his standing. No amount of piety could wash away the impurity in his veins. Meanwhile, old Christian families flaunted their limpieza certificates like badges of honor, using them to monopolize power while painting their greed as holy virtue. The consequences spiraled far beyond individual lives. Whole professions like medicine, law, and banking became gentrified as converso expertise was pushed aside in favor of pure but often less qualified candidates. Universities required blood purity affidavits for enrollment, ensuring knowledge stayed in safe hands. Even marriage turned into a minefield, with families hiring investigators to vet potential spouses' lineages. The Inquisition, once a tribunal for faith, had become an architect of apartheid, one that justified racial exclusion with scripture. And here's the cruelest twist: these laws persisted for centuries, outlasting the Inquisition itself. Long after the last auto da fe, the stigma of impure blood haunted families, shaping everything from social circles to inheritance. The statutes created a hierarchy where privilege wasn't just about wealth or talent, but about an unchangeable past. In the end, limpieza de sangre exposed the Inquisition's ugliest lie: that this was ever about saving souls. It was about crafting a world where power stayed in the hands of those who fit the mold. and where the very idea of purity became a tool to keep everyone else in their place. The interrogation chamber was a theater of dread, every tool designed not just to inflict pain but to break the mind before the body. Take the strappado, a deceptively simple device. Victims' hands were tied behind their backs, then hoisted into the air by a pulley, their shoulders dislocating under their own weight. The real cruelty lay in the interrogator's control. They could drop the prisoner mid-confession, the sudden jerk tearing muscles like overstretched rope, or leave them suspended for hours, the agony growing until even silence became unbearable. This wasn't just torture, it was a gruesome demonstration of who held power over every scream, every moment of relief. Then there was the water torture, where victims were forced onto racks, cloth stuffed down their throats, and water poured slowly over their faces. The sensation of drowning without the mercy of death made the body betray itself, lungs seizing, limbs thrashing against restraints, but the worst torment wasn't physical. It was the interrogator's calm voice promising it would stop if only they'd confess. The victim wasn't just fighting pain, they were fighting their own desperation to believe that mercy existed. Psychological warfare seeped into every detail. Prisoners were often kept in pitch-black cells for weeks, disoriented by endless night, only to be dragged blinking into torchlight for questioning. Sleep deprivation eroded their grip on reality, making them question whether their memories or even their faith were still their own. Some were forced to watch others tortured first, their imaginations magnifying what might come. The inquisitors understood a fundamental truth. Terror thrives on uncertainty, but the ultimate weapon wasn't the rack or the rope, it was the illusion of choice. Victims were told they could end their suffering by admitting guilt, even if the confession was false, and once spoken, those words became chains heavier than iron. A confession, however coerced, justified everything: the property seizures, the public humiliations, the flames of the auto da fe. The Inquisition didn't just want bodies in pain, it wanted souls that had surrendered. In the end, the torture chambers revealed a darker purpose. Breaking individuals was only the beginning. The real goal was to break trust, to turn communities inward, where every whispered doubt might be a spy, every cry for help a trap. Fear, once weaponized, outlived any single victim, lingering in the air like smoke long after the fires had burned out. The auto da fe wasn't just an execution, it was a performance, a grotesque ballet of power choreographed to the screams of the condemned. Picture the scene, a city square packed with thousands, banners of the Inquisition snapping in the breeze as wooden platforms groaned under the weight of chained prisoners. The air reeked of incense and sweat, a sickly contrast to the charred flesh that would soon follow. But this wasn't chaos, it was meticulously staged. Every detail, from the order of the processions to the color of the penitents' robes, served a purpose. The condemned weren't merely punished, they were transformed into symbols, their suffering a spectacle designed to terrify and enthrall. At first glance, these events masqueraded as acts of divine justice. Church officials preached redemption, framing the auto da fe as a chance for the guilty to cleanse their souls before God. But the subtext was unmistakably political. By holding these rituals in central plazas, often timed to coincide with royal birthdays or military victories, the crown fused religious fervor with loyalty to the state. When the Grand Inquisitor raised his cross beside the king's standard, the message was clear. Defiance of the church was defiance of the throne, and the crowd's roar of approval wasn't just piety, it was complicity, a public vow of allegiance sealed with the scent of burning flesh. The victims played their parts perfectly, even against their will. Those who confessed were dressed in San Benito's yellow tunics painted with devils and flames, a walking advertisement of their shame. The unrepentant wore black, their fate already decided. But the real masters of ceremony were the officials who orchestrated every moment. Prisoners were paraded for hours, their exhaustion and fear on full display, while preachers sermonized about the dangers of heresy. By the time the fires were lit, the audience wasn't just witnessing justice, they were participating in it. The line between spectator and executioner blurred as cheers drowned out the victims' cries. And then there were the finances. Auto da fes were shockingly expensive, funded by the crown and local elites. Why pour gold into such grisly theater? Because the returns were staggering. Each spectacle legitimized the Inquisition's grip, ensuring continued confiscations of heretic wealth. Merchants who might balk at new taxes would gladly pay for the privilege of front-row seats to the show. Even the victims' ashes had value, scattered in rivers to erase all memory of their existence, a final assertion of control over life, death, and history itself. The genius of the auto da fe lay in its duality. To the devout, it was a holy rite; to the ambitious, a warning; and to the monarchy, a lesson in raw power, that the surest way to rule isn't just through laws or armies, but through the collective imagination of a people taught to fear and revel in the spectacle of their own submission. Long after the last embers cooled, that lesson lingered, etched not in parchment, but in the trembling hearts of those who'd seen what happened to souls who dared step out of line. The Inquisition's ledger books tell a story far removed from lofty sermons about salvation. Flip through those brittle pages, and you'll find columns of numbers, lists of homes seized, vineyards auctioned, chests of coin counted out for the crown. This wasn't just justice, it was an economy built on fear. Every time an accused heretic confessed, their wealth didn't vanish into some pious void. It flowed straight into royal treasuries, funding wars, palaces, and the very machinery that would hunt the next victim. Take the case of Maria de Bohorquez, a wealthy widow in Seville accused of secretly practicing Judaism in 1520. Her trial lasted less than a month. Her confession, extracted after 3 days on the rack, handed the Inquisition a fortune: a mansion near the cathedral, 600 acres of olive groves, and a chest of silver worth enough to fund a small army. The inquisitors took their cut, 20% off the top, as mandated by royal decree, while the rest padded Ferdinand II's coffers, Maria herself. She vanished into the flames of the next auto da fe, her assets now underwriting the system that killed her. The incentives twisted everything. Inquisitors weren't paid salaries, they earned a percentage of every confiscation. The more they convicted, the richer they became. Soon, creativity flourished in the torture chambers. Accusations broadened to include not just heresy, but suspicion of heresy, a charge so vague it could snare anyone. In Toledo, entire Jewish quarters stood emptied, their doors bearing the Inquisition's seal, their contents sold at auction to the highest bidder, often the same local officials who'd orchestrated the arrest. But the real shock comes when you trace the money up the chain. King Philip II used Inquisition windfalls to bankroll his campaign against the Dutch rebels, while bishops financed cathedral expansions with gifts from terrified families hoping to buy protection. Even the paperwork bled the accused dry. Prisoners were billed for their own imprisonment, room and board, interrogation fees, even the firewood used to burn them. The system had perfected a grim alchemy, turning human lives into currency, and perhaps most damning of all, the Inquisition's own audits. In 1589, a rare internal report from Valencia admitted that nearly 70% of cases involved defendants with significant property. Coincidence? Hardly. The poorest Spaniards rarely faced the tribunal's wrath unless they crossed someone powerful. The lesson was unmistakable. Heresy might damn your soul, but wealth made you a target. This corruption didn't just fund the Inquisition, it fueled its expansion. Every gold coin extracted from a victim paid for new spies, new prisons, new interrogators. The cycle fed itself, growing hungrier with each passing year. By the time the system finally crumbled centuries later, it had consumed fortunes worth billions in today's currency. But the true cost wasn't measured in coins. It was counted in shattered lives, in generations of families who learned too late that faith wasn't the only thing on trial. Their very existence had become someone else's profit margin. The Inquisition didn't just rely on torture and terror. It built one of history's most chillingly efficient bureaucracies. Hidden beneath the hooded robes and fiery sermons was a machine that rivaled modern surveillance states in its meticulous record-keeping. Every accusation, every whispered rumor, every forced confession was catalogued in leather-bound ledgers, cross-referenced and stored in archives that stretched across Spain. These weren't just notes, they were blueprints for control. Take the Libros de Testifications, thick volumes where scribes transcribed testimonies word for word, preserving even the pauses and stutters of terrified witnesses. Names were indexed, relationships mapped, and timelines scrutinized. A single slip of the tongue in 1485 could resurface decades later to condemn a grandchild. And unlike medieval courts where memories faded and documents crumbled, the Inquisition's records were shockingly durable. Paper trails followed families for generations, turning ancestry into evidence. The system's true innovation, standardization. Inquisitors used pre-printed forms with numbered questions, ensuring no detail was overlooked. Officials in Seville could pick up a case file from Barcelona and immediately understand its structure, a level of bureaucratic harmony unheard of in other kingdoms. Even the interrogations followed scripts with prompts designed to trap the accused in contradictions. "You claim you attended Mass last Sunday. Describe the priest's vestments." Failed to remember and your faith was suspect. Remember too well and you were overcompensating, but the real power lay in connectivity. The Relations de Corsa's quarterly reports sent to Madrid allowed the crown to track patterns across regions. If Toledo saw a spike in accusations against moneylenders, Valencia might tighten scrutiny on its financiers. The data wasn't just reactive, it predicted where fear should be stoked next. Perhaps most unnerving was how the system mirrored modern data harvesting. Just as today's algorithms flag suspicious behavior, the Inquisition had its own markers. Did a family avoid pork, light candles on Friday nights? Those habits, once innocuous, became metadata in a dragnet for heresy. And with each generation, the archives grew heavier, the web of suspicion denser. This wasn't just record-keeping, it was social engineering. By weaponizing information, the Inquisition did something far more insidious than burn individuals. It taught an entire civilization to police itself, one carefully documented confession at a time. In the shadows of grand inquisitors like Torquemada, another layer of power games was unfolding, one where local tribunals became personal weapons in the hands of regional strongmen. While the crown saw the Inquisition as a tool for centralization, many provincial inquisitors had their own agendas. Take the case of Inquisitor Diego Deza in Toledo, who used heresy trials to systematically dismantle a rival aristocratic family, the Mendozas. Their crime, blocking his nephew's appointment to a lucrative cathedral post. Suddenly, decades-old rumors about the Mendozas harboring Jewish prayer books resurfaced, backed by witnesses who conveniently owed Deza favors. The family's vast vineyards were confiscated within months, and their political influence crumbled, all under the holy guise of rooting out heresy. This pattern repeated across Spain. In Aragon, Inquisitor Pedro Arboles turned the tribunal into a battleground for regional factions. When local merchants resisted new taxes, Arboles branded their leader a Lutheran sympathizer, a charge so absurd it shocked even Rome. But the damage was done. The Merchants' Guild disbanded, and their warehouses were divided among Arboles' allies. These weren't isolated incidents, they revealed a glaring loophole in the system. While the monarchy controlled the Inquisition's broad strokes, local inquisitors operated with staggering autonomy. Without instant communication, Madrid often learned of abuses only after the fact, if at all. The Basque Country offers the most chilling example. There, Inquisitor Juan de Zumarraga exploited ancient tensions between coastal and mountain villages. When fishermen in Bilbao refused to sell their catch at prices set by his cronies, Zumarraga launched an investigation into witchcraft among their wives. Dozens were arrested based on evidence like birthmarks or knowledge of herbal remedies. The resulting panic allowed him to install compliant officials in the town council, all while the real witches rotted in cells. What made these power grabs possible? The Inquisition's very structure. Local tribunals functioned as self-contained courts, with inquisitors serving as judge, jury, and when it suited them, political kingmakers. Unlike royal magistrates, they answered to no secular authority, and their decisions couldn't be appealed to civilian courts. Combine that impunity with the universal fear of being labeled a heretic, and you had a perfect recipe for corruption. Even confessions could be weaponized. In Valencia, a disgraced notary named Luis Garcia discovered this the hard way. After testifying against a rival under torture, he expected leniency. Instead, the inquisitor used his coerced statement to blackmail him into implicating others, a human domino effect that toppled half the city's notary guild. By the time Garcia was finally burned at the stake, he'd unwittingly helped the tribunal seize control of legal document fees across the region. The lesson was clear. In the hands of ambitious men, the Inquisition became less about faith than feudal politics by other means. It wasn't just a sword dangling over Spain's neck. It was 1,000 daggers in the hands of petty tyrants, each twisting the system to carve out their own fiefdoms of fear. And for every auto da fe that served the crown's interests, dozens more lined the pockets of men who understood that in the business of heresy hunting, the real blasphemy was standing in their way. By the 1520s, a new specter haunted Spain, not secret Jews or Muslims, but the creeping influence of Protestantism drifting across Europe like a heresy-laden fog. At first glance, the Inquisition's response seemed predictable: double down on interrogations, tighten surveillance, and burn any smuggled Lutheran pamphlets alongside their readers. But beneath the surface, this wasn't just about stamping out theological dissent. It was about geopolitics, a silent war where faith became the battlefield and the Inquisition, Spain's bulwark against Northern Europe's rising tide. Consider the timing. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to that Wittenberg church door in 1517, Spain was the continent's superpower, its gold-filled galleons and tercio armies the envy of kings. But Protestantism threatened more than souls. It undermined the very alliances holding Spain's empire together. The Habsburg dynasty ruled both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, a fragile patchwork of German states now fracturing along religious lines. Every peasant chanting Lutheran hymns in Saxony weakened Madrid's grip on Central Europe. The Inquisition, ever the crown's flexible tool, pivoted seamlessly from targeting conversos to hunting Luteranos, a label so broad it could snare anyone with a suspicious book or a muttered complaint about church taxes. The methods grew viciously creative. In Barcelona, a Flemish merchant named Hendrik van Braun was arrested in 1534 not for owning Protestant texts, but for the ink stains on his fingers, proof, the inquisitors claimed, he'd copied forbidden verses. His trial revealed the real fear. Trade routes were heresy's highways. Dutch weavers, Hanseatic bankers, even Venetian diplomats were suddenly suspect, their commercial networks recast as clandestine faith smuggling operations. The Inquisition's reach extended beyond Spain's borders, with spies embedded in ports from Antwerp to Genoa, watching for crates of heretical wool that might conceal pamphlets. Yet the crackdown's brutality betrayed its insecurity. Auto da fe featuring Protestant conspirators became elaborate propaganda. In Valladolid, 1559, 24 accused Lutherans were paraded before Prince Philip himself, their executions timed to coincide with his departure to crush Dutch rebels. The message was clear: disloyalty to Rome meant disloyalty to Spain, but the overreach backfired. When the Inquisition arrested Carlos de Siso, an Italian-born courtier, even the Vatican protested. His connections to powerful Florentine bankers made him politically untouchable. The tribunal reluctantly freed him, exposing the limits of its power when real money and influence were at stake. What began as doctrinal policing soon revealed Spain's Achilles heel. Protestantism wasn't just a faith, it was the banner of rising rivals: England, the Dutch Republic, German principalities, all chipping away at Habsburg dominance. Every Lutheran burned in Madrid was a warning to Amsterdam, every smuggled Bible confiscated in Seville a shot across London's bow. The Inquisition, once a domestic terror, had become an instrument of imperial panic, its fires less about purity than about a crumbling empire's desperate grasp on a world that was slipping away. In the end, the Protestant hunt proved one thing: no amount of fear could stem the tide of change. Spain's iron grip might silence dissent within its borders, but beyond the Pyrenees the Reformation flourished, and with it, the slow unraveling of everything the Inquisition sought to defend. The healer's hands were her crime. In village after village across 16th century Spain, women who knew the properties of herbs, who could ease childbirth or set a broken bone, found themselves dragged before the Inquisition's tribunals. Their real offense wasn't witchcraft, it was stepping outside the rigid boundaries of a society terrified of female autonomy. While the Inquisition's fires are often painted with broad strokes of religious fanaticism, dig deeper into the trial records and a darker pattern emerges. Over 70% of those accused of sorcery weren't clandestine devil worshippers, they were women whose knowledge threatened the established order. Take the case of Isabel de la Cruz, a midwife in rural Extremadura. When a local noblewoman died in childbirth despite Isabel's efforts, the family needed someone to blame. The inquisitors didn't accuse her of incompetence, they claimed she'd made a pact with the devil to strangle newborns. Her trial transcript reveals the absurdity. Witnesses swore they'd seen her whispering to the wind, likely murmuring comfort to laboring mothers, and applying unguents that reeked of sulfur, probably onion poultices for inflammation. The truth, Isabel's real sin was her independence. She traveled alone between villages, carried her own earnings, and most dangerously commanded respect from women who trusted her more than their parish priests. The Inquisition weaponized this fear brilliantly. By framing female healers as witches, they turned communities against their own matriarchs. Old grudges found fertile ground, a neighbor's envy over a thriving herb garden, a spurned suitor's revenge, even rival midwives looking to eliminate competition. The tribunals welcomed these accusations eagerly, recognizing how easily witchcraft could explain anything from a failed harvest to a nobleman's impotence. And once a woman was branded a heretic, every aspect of her life became evidence. Did she own a black cat, familiar, collect moon water for tonics, devil's baptism? Even kindness was suspect. Feeding the poor might mean recruiting souls for Satan, but the most perverse twist lay in the interrogations themselves. Women accused of witchcraft faced uniquely humiliating examinations, public stripping to hunt for devil's marks, invasive body searches by male inquisitors, and torture devices like the witch's bridle, designed to silence their voices literally and symbolically. The process wasn't just about extracting confessions, it was about stripping away dignity, reducing knowledgeable women to terrified spectacles for the crowd's gawking pleasure. And the Inquisition's records betray their own hypocrisy. While hundreds of female healers burned, male physicians whose scientific remedies often involved bleeding patients to death faced no such scrutiny. A licensed doctor could prescribe mercury for syphilis and call it medicine, but a village woman offering willow bark tea for fever was poisoning minds against God. The double standard couldn't have been clearer. This wasn't about safeguarding health. It was about controlling who held power over life itself. By the 17th century, the damage was irreversible. Generations of herbal knowledge vanished as wise women took their secrets to the grave or fled to remote mountains. The Inquisition hadn't just executed individuals, it had severed an ancient thread of female wisdom, one that had woven communities together long before priests or kings claimed authority over bodies and souls. And in its place, a new orthodoxy where pain in childbirth became God's will, where illness was a test of faith, and where women who dared to know too much learned the hardest lesson of all, that in the eyes of the system, empowerment itself was the ultimate heresy. Imagine a world where the wrong book could cost you your life. In 1559, the Spanish Inquisition unveiled its ultimate weapon against dissent, not the rack or the stake, but ink and parchment. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of forbidden books, wasn't just a list. It was the first systematic attempt to control thought itself and the targets. Anything that threatened the twin pillars of Spanish power, the Church's monopoly on truth and the Crown's grip on society. The censorship began with predictable entries, Lutheran tracts, Hebrew prayer books, Quranic texts. But the net widened swiftly. Scientific works by Copernicus and Vesalius were banned for challenging biblical cosmology. Chivalric romances like Amadis of Gaul vanished from shelves, deemed dangerous for glorifying personal honor over obedience to priests and kings. Even translations of the Bible into vernacular Spanish were outlawed, because nothing terrified the authorities more than ordinary people interpreting scripture for themselves. What made the Index uniquely sinister was its bureaucratic precision. Teams of theologians, lawyers, and scholars pored over texts line by line, compiling offenses into categories: heretical, immoral, dangerously innovative. Printers faced ruin if caught with banned type. Booksellers kept two inventories, one for public display, another hidden under floorboards. The system relied on neighbors denouncing neighbors, with rewards for turning in those who whispered about forbidden ideas over dinner. But this wasn't just about souls, it was about silencing critics of the state. When Bartolomé de las Casas's a short account of the destruction of the Indies exposed Spanish atrocities in the Americas, it landed on the Index not for heresy, but for embarrassing the crown. Likewise, Machiavelli's The Prince was banned not because it was godless, but because its cynical power plays mirrored too closely the monarchy's own machinations. The Index's true brilliance lay in its self-perpetuating nature. By controlling access to knowledge, the Inquisition ensured future generations would lack the intellectual tools to question their rulers. Universities taught from sanitized texts, their curricula stripped of philosophy that might inspire doubt. A merchant class that might have challenged aristocratic privilege remained docile, never exposed to Enlightenment ideas percolating north of the Pyrenees. Ironically, the system faltered against its own success. As banned books grew more tantalizing, a black market flourished. Wealthy nobles built secret libraries behind false walls, their contraband volumes passed hand to hand like treasure. When the Inquisition raided one such collection in Seville in 1623, they found notes in the margins, debates between readers that proved censorship had backfired. Forbidden words, once read, sparked fiercer dissent than if they'd circulated freely. In the end, the Index exposed the regime's deepest fear, that ideas once unleashed could not be unthought. Every page burned, every printer silenced, was an admission that the Inquisition's power had limits. You could break bodies, but knowledge was harder to kill. It seeped through borders, hid in memories, and waited patient as ink on parchment for the day when Spain would no longer be able to police every thought in the dark. The galleons that sailed from Seville to Veracruz in the 16th century carried more than spices and silver. They transported an entire system of terror. When the Spanish Inquisition reached Mexico in 1571, it didn't arrive as a mere copy of its European counterpart. It morphed into something far more insidious, the sharp edge of colonial exploitation, disguised as divine mandate. The tribunal's first auto da fe in Mexico City wasn't held in some shadowy dungeon, but in the Zocalo, the beating heart of the new empire, where thousands gathered to watch flames consume not just people, but any resistance to Spanish rule. At first glance, the charges seemed familiar: heresy, blasphemy, crypto-Judaism, but dig deeper and the real agenda emerged. Among the earliest victims were Nahua nobles who'd resisted handing over their lands to encomienda overlords. Suddenly, their ancestral rituals became idolatry, their resistance reclassified as devil worship. One particularly damning trial transcript from 1582 accuses Don Carlos Chichimcatacotl, a Tlaxcalan leader, of invoking pre-Hispanic demons after he refused to surrender his community's corn stores to Spanish officials. His execution served twin purposes: eliminating a troublemaker and warning other indigenous elites what happened to those who prioritized their people's survival over colonial quotas. The Inquisition's true innovation in Mexico was its role in controlling the flow of wealth. Silver mines like Zacatecas and Guanajuato became prime hunting grounds where enslaved African laborers and indigenous miners faced accusations of witchcraft whenever accidents slowed production. In Potosi, the infamous mountain that eats men, inquisitors targeted mateos, forced indigenous workers who collapsed from exhaustion, claiming their fatigue was possession by lazy spirits. The solution: more prayers overseen by Spanish priests and harsher quotas, but the most brazen exploitation targeted the colony's mixed-race populations. Mestizo merchants thriving in the silk trade suddenly found themselves accused of Judaizing if they undercut Spanish competitors. The trial of Isabel de Montoya in 1615 exposed the pattern. Her successful textile workshops were confiscated after witnesses swore she'd secretly observed Sabbath. The real crime: her prices were bankrupting the wife of a tribunal notary. Even the persecution of crypto-Jews took on a colonial twist. Many accused were Portuguese traders whose ships carried silver to Manila. Eliminating them handed Spanish merchants a monopoly on the Pacific trade. What made the Mexican Inquisition uniquely terrifying was its bureaucratic reach. Unlike Spain, where competing power centers sometimes checked the tribunal's excesses, the colonies offered no such safeguards. Inquisitors worked hand in glove with viceroys, their spies embedded in every port, mine, and mission. When a Franciscan friar in Michoacán, Fray Alonso de la Vera Cruz, dared to criticize labor conditions in 1560, he wasn't just defrocked, his entire library of indigenous language manuscripts was burned as heretical, erasing years of ethnographic work that might have preserved native perspectives. By the 17th century, the system had perfected its extraction machinery. The tribunal's Mexico City palace boasted vaults where confiscated cocoa beans, silver bars, and cochineal dye piled up alongside torture devices. A surviving ledger from 1648 shows over 200,000 pesos seized from heretics, enough to outfit 3 full infantry regiments for Spain's European wars. The Inquisition hadn't just crossed the Atlantic, it had become the empire's financial pump, sucking wealth from the colonies under the sacred cover of saving souls. Yet resistance flickered in unexpected ways. In Oaxaca, Zapotec communities hid codices inside confessionals, tricking priests into safeguarding the very pagan texts they sought to destroy. Afro-Mexican cofradias, religious brotherhoods, used saint processions as cover for forbidden Yoruba rites. And when the tribunal arrested a Nahua healer named Antonia in 1690, her village staged a miracle, planting a glowing cross in her cell that forced her release. The message was clear: even the Inquisitions might bow to public pressure when colonial stability was at stake. This was the brutal irony of Mexico's spiritual conquest. The louder the tribunal preached purity, the more it revealed itself as the ultimate colonial marketplace where faith was the currency, fear the commodity, and human lives the price of doing business. Long after the last auto da fe's embers cooled, that legacy would linger, etched into the very foundations of a society built on holy terror and unholy greed. The flames of the Spanish Inquisition didn't stop at the Pyrenees. They leaped across borders, carried by the winds of dynastic ambition. When Portugal established its own Inquisition in 1536, the move seemed like pious solidarity with Spain. But peel back the surface and you'll find a tangled web of royal marriages, imperial rivalries, and a desperate scramble for control of global trade routes. This wasn't just about faith, it was about two crowns playing chess with human lives. At first glance, Portugal's Inquisition mirrored Spain's, the same hooded inquisitors, the same auto-da face lighting up Lisbon's plazas. But the timing reveals the real catalyst. Just 3 years earlier, King John III of Portugal had married Catherine of Austria, the niece of Spain's Emperor Charles V. The union wasn't just romantic, it was strategic, binding Portugal to Habsburg power as Spain's empire stretched from the Andes to the Philippines. Establishing an inquisition became Portugal's dowry payment, proof of allegiance to the Catholic superbloc reshaping Europe. Yet the persecutions took a distinct Portuguese flavor. While Spain hunted conversos suspected of Jewish practices, Lisbon's tribunals focused overwhelmingly on New Christians, Jewish converts who dominated Portugal's spice trade with Asia and Africa. The pattern was glaring. The wealthiest merchant families faced accusations precisely when their fleets returned laden with pepper and gold. Take the case of Duarte da Paz, a financier whose ships supplied Portuguese forts in India. In 1542, rivals whispered that his grandmother had lit Sabbath candles. Days later, his warehouses were sealed by inquisitors, their contents donated to the crown. The Vatican saw through the charade. Pope Paul III initially resisted approving Portugal's Inquisition, suspecting it was less about heresy than monopolizing commerce. His letters to King John dripped with sarcasm. "We marvel that so many heretics seem to prosper in exactly those professions your Majesty wishes to control." But pressure from Spain and the threat of losing Habsburg military support forced his hand. By 1547, the Pope's compromise was in tatters. The Portuguese Inquisition, now autonomous, began mass deportations of new Christians to Brazil, effectively exiling the colony's most skilled traders and replacing them with crown-appointed lackeys. The darkest twist came in the colonies themselves. Portugal's Inquisition followed its victims across oceans. In Goa, the tribunal's edicts of faith required locals to denounce anyone practicing Hindu rituals, a convenient tool for seizing temples and their gold. Meanwhile, in Brazil, enslaved Africans accused of witchcraft were tortured until they confessed to conspiracies, justifying harsher plantation controls. The machinery of terror wasn't just imported, it was adapted to serve imperial economics at every latitude. But the system's true hypocrisy flared during the Dutch-Portuguese War. When Protestant Dutch forces captured Portuguese sugar plantations in 1630, the Inquisition suddenly discovered loyal Catholics among formerly persecuted New Christians, begging them to fund the reconquest. Overnight, ancestral heresies were forgiven provided the accused opened their coffers. The message was clear: faith was flexible when empires trembled. What began as a Spanish export became something far more cynical. Portugal's Inquisition proved that terror could wear many masks, sometimes a hooded robe, sometimes a royal decree, sometimes a marriage contract. And in the shadows between them, the truly devout weren't the ones kneeling in prayer but the kings counting their coins. The year 1492 is etched in history for more than Columbus's voyage. It's the year Spain expelled its Jewish population with the Alhambra Decree, a move the crown claimed would purify the nation. But the economic aftershocks would haunt Spain for centuries, unraveling the very unity the Inquisition promised to protect. Overnight, entire sectors of the economy shuddered. Jewish merchants who dominated textile trades from Toledo to Valencia vanished, their looms falling silent. Tax revenues from their businesses, which had funded everything from road repairs to royal militias, evaporated. In Seville alone, records show a 60% drop in silk exports within 5 years of the expulsion, a collapse that left entire neighborhoods ghostly with abandoned workshops. The financial hemorrhaging went deeper than lost guilds. Jewish financiers had been the backbone of Spain's credit networks, offering loans to farmers between harvests and advancing capital to explorers like Columbus himself. With their exile, interest rates soared, squeezing landowners into selling estates to repay debts. Even the crown felt the pinch. When Ferdinand needed funds for his Italian wars in 1501, he found himself begging Genoese bankers, the same foreigners he'd once scorned as unclean, to fill the void left by exiled Jewish lenders. The irony was brutal. Spain had traded its most reliable creditors for a dependence on rivals, but the most devastating blow came in the realm of medicine. Jewish doctors, often barred from serving Christian elites openly, had nonetheless been the hidden architects of public health, treating plagues in the shadows. Their expulsion left cities vulnerable. When typhus ravaged Barcelona in 1508, the death toll tripled compared to previous outbreaks, a grim testament to the expertise Spain had banished. Even the aristocracy suffered. Queen Isabella's own chronicler, Andrés Bernaldez, lamented that the bleeding of veins and dosing of herbs fell to butchers after Jewish physicians fled. The crown's attempt to replace this economic engine only deepened the crisis. Confiscated Jewish properties were handed to loyal nobles, but without the expelled families' commercial savvy, vineyards wilted and silver mines flooded. In Murcia, a once thriving Jewish quarter became a slum within a decade, its synagogues repurposed as storage barns. Meanwhile, Portugal, where many exiled Spanish Jews resettled, saw its own economy flourish, particularly in maritime insurance and diamond cutting, industries refugees brought with them. By the mid-1600s, the consequences were undeniable. Spain's treasury, bloated with New World gold, still struggled with bankruptcies, while Dutch and Italian rivals who'd welcomed Jewish refugees outpaced it in trade and innovation. The Inquisition's promise of unity through purity had backfired spectacularly. Instead of strengthening Spain, the expulsion shattered its economic pillars, leaving a hollowed-out kingdom clinging to dogma while its rivals thrived on the very diversity it had feared. The lesson was written in the ledgers if anyone dared to read them. A nation cannot burn its brightest minds and expect to keep the light. The decision to expel Spain's Moriscos in 1609 wasn't born from a sudden surge of religious fervor. It was a cold calculation wrapped in the cloak of holy war. By the early 17th century, these descendants of Muslim converts to Christianity had lived under Catholic rule for over 100 years. Their Arabic prayers replaced by Ave Marias, their mosques reborn as parish churches. On paper, they were model Christians, but the crown saw something far more dangerous lurking beneath their compliance, a potential fifth column for the Ottoman Empire, whose galleys prowled the Mediterranean just a day's sail from Spanish shores. Consider the timing. The expulsion decree came just months after Spanish forces clashed with Ottoman-backed pirates at the Battle of Cape Caledonia, a skirmish that exposed how vulnerable Spain's coastline was to surprise attacks. Intelligence reports buzzed with rumors of Morisco fishermen passing maps to Algerian corsairs, of secret networks smuggling coded messages to Istanbul. Whether these accusations held truth scarcely mattered, the fear alone was enough. King Philip III's advisors painted the Moriscos as living arrows in the Sultan's quiver, their very existence a strategic liability. The economic justification proved equally cynical. Morisco communities dominated fertile regions like Valencia, where their irrigation techniques turned arid soil into lush orchards. Their expulsion wasn't just about security, it was a land grab disguised as piety. Within months of the decree, Valencian nobles seized vacated farms, only to watch crop yields plummet as their own farmers lacked the Morisco's ancestral knowledge. A contemporary account by Friar Jaime Bleda boasts of 300,000 heretics purged, but neglects to mention the ensuing famine that spiked bread prices across Aragon. What made this expulsion uniquely sinister was its bureaucratic efficiency. Unlike the messy, ad hoc persecution of Jews in 1492, the Morisco removal was a military operation. Census records were cross-referenced to root out entire lineages. Coastal towns were emptied first to prevent escapes by sea, with families given just 3 days to abandon homes they'd occupied for generations. Those who resisted were marched to ports under guard, their belongings auctioned before they'd even boarded ships bound for North Africa. But the deepest irony lay in the exiles' reception. Many Moriscos, raised as Christians for centuries, found themselves strangers in Muslim lands. Ottoman chronicles describe bewildered arrivals who didn't know the Quran's opening verses, their Spanish clothing marking them as outsiders in fez and tunies. Some were even enslaved by the very empires Spain feared they'd aid a tragic end for people caught between two worlds, sacrificed not for their faith but for a crown's paranoia. The aftershocks rippled across empires. Spain's Mediterranean rivals gained thousands of skilled laborers overnight. Morisco silk weavers revitalized Tunisian workshops, while their agricultural expertise boosted Moroccan olive yields. Meanwhile, Spanish garrisons in Italy struggled to replace the Morisco soldiers who'd once formed elite units. The expulsion's architects had envisioned a stronger, more secure Spain. Instead, they'd handed their enemies the very human capital they'd sought to destroy. Long after the last deportation ship sailed, the empty villages stood as mute witnesses to the real heresy, not any failure of conversion, but the delusion that a nation could purge its way to security. The Moriscos hadn't been expelled for what they believed, but for what they represented. A reminder that Spain's golden age was built on borrowed knowledge, and that the walls between civilizations had always been more porous than the crown dared admit. The Inquisition's robes hid more than faces. They concealed entire networks of graft and greed, where holy office became a license to steal. Take the case of Inquisitor Diego Rodriguez Lucero in Cordoba, whose reign of terror between 1505 and 1508 wasn't just about rooting out heresy, it was a real estate scheme masquerading as piety. Lucero's tribunal specialized in targeting wealthy converso families, extracting confessions through torture, then donating their confiscated olive groves and townhouses to his own relatives. When a local bishop protested, Lucero had him arrested for sympathizing with heretics, seizing his diocese's treasury for inquisitorial expenses. The scam collapsed only when Lucero overreached, accusing the Duke of Medina Sidonia's wife of witchcraft, a power play that finally forced the crown to intervene. But Lucero was no outlier. In Valencia, Inquisitor Juan de Rojas faced trial in 1542 for orchestrating a protection racket. Merchants could avoid heresy charges by paying tithes directly to his pockets, with receipts forged as charitable donations. One silk trader's ledger, preserved in the Spanish archives, shows monthly payments labeled El Seguro, the insurance, next to sketches of Rojas's signature torture device. The tribunal's own accountant later testified that over half the confiscated gold in Rojas's district never reached Madrid, diverted instead to his mistress's dowry and a private chapel lined with stolen Jewish silver. The rot reached the highest levels. In 1581, Grand Inquisitor Gaspar de Quiroga was caught redirecting funds meant for prisoner sustenance to his nephew's military campaign in Flanders. When auditors questioned the missing 60,000 ducats, Quiroga produced backdated orders reclassifying the funds as spiritual aid for Catholic troops. The sheer brazenness exposed the system's immunity. Even when caught, inquisitors simply rebranded theft as holy necessity. Perhaps most revealing were the petty scams. In Saragossa, prisoners complained of moldy bread and rancid water, until investigators discovered the jailer was selling their allotted rations at market, replacing them with garbage. In Cuenca, a notary charged families 2 ducats per page to read trial documents, then smeared the ink to demand repeat payments. These weren't anomalies, they were symptoms of a system where unchecked power bred entitlement at every level. The Vatican's own archives hold damning evidence of systemic complicity. A 1593 letter from Pope Clement VIII laments that Spanish inquisitors act more as tax collectors than shepherds, yet Rome's protests were toothless. When Madrid's council finally convened to reform the tribunals in 1608, the resulting report, buried for centuries, admitted that over 40% of inquisitors had faced credible corruption allegations. Their solution, a pay raise for tribunal staff, justified as preventing temptation. This wasn't just hypocrisy, it was institutionalized exploitation. The Inquisition's genius lay in making graft indistinguishable from godliness, where every stolen acre could be framed as divine justice, every bribe as spiritual upkeep. And in that blurring of lines between piety and pilfering, the true heresy was revealed. That faith had become the ultimate currency, and salvation its most marketable commodity. Voltaire's pen dripped with venom when he wrote about the Spanish Inquisition. By the 18th century, Europe's thinkers had begun wielding its atrocities like a scalpel, dissecting not just religious fanaticism, but the rotten foundations of absolute power itself. In his philosophical dictionary, the French philosopher mocked inquisitors as holy executioners whose cruelty exposed a deeper truth: that church and state, when fused into a single instrument of terror, created monsters. His words weren't just criticism, they were a rallying cry. Across salons from Paris to St. Petersburg, the Inquisition became Enlightenment Europe's favorite horror story, a cautionary tale of what happened when authority went unchecked by reason. Spain's own archives fueled the fire. When government reformers like Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos gained access to sealed tribunal records in the 1770s, they uncovered ledgers detailing confessions extracted by water torture, lists of children imprisoned for their parents' alleged heresies, even receipts for bribes paid to falsify testimony. These weren't ancient scandals. Many torturers still held pensions, their crimes rewarded with state funds. Jovellanos's reports shocked even King Charles III, who privately admitted the Inquisition had become a chain around Spain's neck. But the damage wasn't just reputational. The revelations gave ammunition to reformers, arguing that any institution claiming divine mandate, whether monarchy or church, needed radical transparency to prevent abuse. The Inquisition's shadow stretched into America's founding debates. Thomas Jefferson kept a dog-eared copy of A History of the Inquisition of Spain by Juan Antonio Laurent on his desk, scribbling marginalia that compared papal bulls to royal decrees. Both, he argued, were tools to frighten men into submission. When drafting the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1786, Jefferson explicitly banned ecclesiastical courts, a direct rebuke to the inquisitorial model. Even the U.S. Constitution's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment echoed Enlightenment critiques of Spanish torture techniques, with John Adams citing inquisitorial practices as the ultimate example of state-sanctioned barbarity. Yet the backlash's sharpest irony unfolded in Spain itself. Reformers like Benito Jeronimo Feijoo used the Inquisition's own censorship against it, publishing essays that slipped past tribunal censors by framing critiques as historical analysis. His Teatro Critico Universal dissected auto da fe with clinical detachment, letting readers draw their own conclusions about their brutality. The strategy worked too well. By the 1780s, Madrid's elites whispered that the Inquisition had become a liability, a relic scaring away foreign investors and embarrassing Spain at diplomatic tables. The Enlightenment's triumph wasn't just in discrediting the Inquisition, it was in exposing the lie at its core. No ruler, no priest, no institution could claim infallibility when their crimes were laid bare in ink and eyewitness accounts. For the philosophers who wielded those stories, the real heresy wasn't questioning God, it was failing to question the men who claimed to speak for him. And in that revelation, the world found a new dogma. That light, not fear, was the only antidote to tyranny. Napoleon's troops marched into Madrid in December of 1808, their boots trampling over centuries of tradition. And with a single decree, the French emperor did what reformers had failed to accomplish in 300 years. He abolished the Spanish Inquisition, overnight the tribunals shuttered, their prisons emptied, and the dreaded San Benito robes were tossed onto bonfires in the streets. But this wasn't some enlightened liberation. Napoleon's move was a calculated strike at the heart of Spanish resistance. By dismantling the Inquisition, an institution so tightly bound to the crown that its very existence depended on royal patronage, he exposed the ugly truth. The so-called Holy Office had always been a political weapon, not a divine mandate. The timing was no accident. With King Ferdinand VII imprisoned in France, Spain's junta was rallying peasants and priests alike to fight the invaders under the banner of God and King. The Inquisition had become a symbol of national identity, its fires conflated with Spanish sovereignty itself. So Napoleon yanked the rug out. His officials plastered cities with proclamations declaring the tribunal a tool of tyranny masked as religion. And suddenly, the same institution that had terrorized generations was recast as a relic of backwardness. The irony was delicious. French soldiers, men who'd looted cathedrals across Europe, posing as liberators, while Spanish bishops howled about sacrilege. But the real revelation lay in the aftermath. Without the crown's authority, the Inquisition's machinery ground to a halt. Inquisitors accustomed to absolute power found themselves begging French bureaucrats for pensions. Archives brimming with blackmail material were seized and paraded through towns as proof of the tribunal's corruption. In Seville, locals broke into a tribunal vault and discovered chests of gold-labeled limosnas para los pobres, alms for the poor, that had never left the Inquisitors' coffers. The facade of spiritual duty crumbled, revealing a bureaucracy that couldn't survive without royal enforcement. Yet Napoleon's gambit backfired spectacularly. Instead of gratitude, Spaniards saw the abolition as proof of foreign sacrilege. Priests preached that the French were doing the devil's work, and guerrilla fighters used the Inquisition's abolition to stoke anti-French fury. By 1814, when Ferdinand reclaimed the throne, his first act was reinstating the tribunal, not because Spain still needed heresy trials, but because the Inquisition's resurrection symbolized the monarchy's triumph over foreign interference. The brief interregnum laid bare the institution's fragile foundations. Strip away royal decrees and armored guards, and the Holy Office was just a room full of aging men with empty threats. Napoleon hadn't just exposed the Inquisition's dependence on the state, he'd revealed that its power had always been borrowed, a phantom that vanished the moment kings stopped whispering in its ear. And in that realization, Spaniards glimpsed a future where fear might no longer be the currency of power. The year 1834 didn't just mark the end of the Spanish Inquisition, it exposed how hollow the institution had become. After centuries of terror, the tribunal's final dissolution wasn't some dramatic auto-da-fe. It was a footnote in a parliamentary decree, quietly snuffing out an institution that had already lost its teeth. But the real story isn't in the paperwork, it's in the political earthquake that made it possible. Liberal reformers, fresh from Spain's first constitutional revolution, saw the Inquisition for what it truly was, a rotting relic propped up by absolutist kings. When they finally tore it down, they weren't just abolishing a court, they were severing a lifeline between throne and altar that had strangled Spain's progress for generations. The death blow came from an unlikely source, a regent queen. Maria Cristina, ruling for her infant daughter Isabella II, faced a kingdom fractured by civil war between liberals and traditionalists. To secure liberal support, she signed the royal order disbanding the Inquisition in July 1834, stripping it of even its ceremonial functions. The irony was brutal. An institution that had once toppled kings now fell at the stroke of a regent's pen, its fate tied to the very political winds it had failed to suppress. Yet the tribunal's ghost lingered. Former inquisitors slithered into new roles as censors or conservative lawmakers, repackaging their repression as public morality campaigns. The archives tell a telling story. In 1843, a parliamentary investigation found that over 70% of the books banned under Isabella II's reign had originally been blacklisted by the Inquisition. The mechanisms of control outlived the institution itself, repurposed for a new era. Even the physical remnants refused to fade. Secret torture chambers were discovered behind false walls in Seville's old tribunal building as late as 1868, their rusted irons and blood-stained confessionals preserved like macabre museum pieces. And in remote villages, folklorists recorded children's rhymes as late as the 1920s, warning that the hooded ones still watch. The fear outlasted the institution by generations. The true legacy, though, wasn't in the shadows, it was in the law books. Modern Spain struggled to separate church and state, its bitter debates over historical memory, even its 21st century laws compensating descendants of the persecuted, all bear the fingerprints of the Inquisition's long shadow. When archaeologists uncovered a mass grave in Cordoba in 2008 filled with bones bearing torture marks, the headlines didn't call them medieval crimes. They called them Spain's unfinished business. The lesson echoed across centuries: you can abolish an institution with a decree, but dismantling its hold on a nation's psyche. That takes lifetimes. For centuries, the Spanish Inquisition's death toll was accepted as gospel: tens of thousands burned, hundreds of thousands tortured, a genocide cloaked in holy vestments. But crack open modern archives with forensic tools instead of ideological assumptions, and a startling revision emerges. Historians like Henry Kamen and William Monter have combed through actual trial records, not Protestant propaganda or Enlightenment polemics, and the numbers tell a different story. Between 1478 and 1834, the Inquisition executed around 3,000 people, a fraction of the mythologized figures. That's not to minimize the horror. Each life extinguished was a tragedy, but context reshapes the narrative. Compare those numbers to secular courts of the same era, where witch trials in Germany claimed over 25,000 lives, or England's bloody assizes hanged more people in a single year than Spain's tribunals did in a century. The Inquisition wasn't uniquely monstrous, it was monstrously bureaucratic. The mortality myth stems from conflating all religious violence under one banner. Early estimates, like those of Spanish friar Juan de Mariana, lumped together medieval pogroms, royal expulsions, and inquisitorial sentences into one apocalyptic tally. But the tribunal's own meticulous records, preserved in Spain's Archivo Histórico Nacional, reveal a grim paradox: the Inquisition preferred penitence over pious. Only about 2% of cases ended in execution. Most heretics faced fines, public shaming, or pilgrimage. Even auto da fe, those harrowing spectacles of flame, often burned effigies of fugitives or exhumed bones rather than living victims. The real terror wasn't in the body count, it was in the chilling efficiency of the system, its ability to make entire populations police themselves without needing mass slaughter. Revisionist scholarship points to another uncomfortable truth. Local communities often drove the violence, not distant inquisitors. In Barcelona, archives show priests pleading with tribunals to show mercy, only to be overruled by mobs demanding blood. A 1582 case in Logroño saw townsfolk riot when the tribunal acquitted a suspected witch, forcing a retrial. The Inquisition didn't invent Spain's intolerance, it channeled and occasionally restrained it. Some of its notorious brutality, like the gruesome tortures, was standard judicial practice across Europe. What set Spain apart wasn't the savagery, but the branding, the way its repression was etched into history as uniquely Catholic, uniquely Spanish. The numbers debate obscures a deeper shift in historical understanding. Focusing solely on deaths misses the Inquisition's lasting damage, the generations of trauma, the stifling of intellectual life, the way it twisted faith into a cudgel for social control. Modern scholars like Gretchen Starr-Lebeau analyze trial transcripts not for execution tallies, but for patterns of coercion, how interrogators weaponized language to break minds before bodies. A 1720 trial in Cuenca reveals a weaver confessing to witchcraft after being asked leading questions for 72 hours straight. Her testimony, a script the inquisitors had already written. The horror wasn't just in how many died, but in how many lived in silent terror, their spirits fractured long before the flames could touch them. This recalibration isn't about absolving the Inquisition, it's about understanding its true dimensions. The tribunal's power lay not in endless bonfires, but in the shadow it cast over daily life. The neighbor who crossed himself too often, the merchant who hesitated before swearing on a crucifix, the child taught to report her parents' dinner prayers. By fixating on exaggerated body counts, we risk missing the subtler lesson that oppression thrives not just through violence, but through the quiet, relentless machinery of fear. The archives don't exonerate the Inquisition, they indict it more precisely, revealing an institution that mastered the art of control with chilling precision, one whispered confession at a time. Most people hear Inquisition and picture Spain's hooded tribunals, but the idea didn't start there. Centuries before Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic Church had already perfected the art of hunting heresy through earlier versions. The medieval Inquisition in 12th century France and the Roman Inquisition born in 1542. Yet comparing these systems reveals a stark truth: Spain's iteration wasn't just a religious court. It was a political revolution disguised as piety, a departure so radical it reshaped what an Inquisition could even be. Take the medieval Inquisition, launched in the 1230s to crush the Cathar heresy in southern France. Unlike Spain's centralized monarchy pulling the strings, this earlier model answered directly to the Pope, with friars like the infamous Conrad of Marburg acting as roving enforcers. Their targets were theological dissidents, not political rivals. When Conrad accused Count Henry of saying of heresy in 1233, the German nobility revolted, forcing the Pope to rein in his overzealous agent. The lesson: medieval inquisitors lacked Spain's royal muscle. They could be checked by secular lords. Spain's tribunal, by contrast, was the state, its authority fused with the crown's will. The Roman Inquisition, established to combat Protestantism, seems closer to Spain's model, but dig deeper. While Rome's version prized doctrinal precision, Galileo's trial famously revolved around heliocentrism's heresy. Spain's inquisitors often ignored theology altogether. Their trials focused on ancestry, whether a suspect's great-grandmother lit Sabbath candles, not fine points of grace or transubstantiation. The Roman Inquisition also allowed defense attorneys and appeals to the Pope, however rare. Spain's prisoners faced secret accusations, barred from knowing their accusers or even the charges until the interrogation began. What truly set Spain apart was its financial engine. Medieval inquisitors confiscated property, but the spoils flowed to local bishops or Rome. The Roman Inquisition fined heretics, yet those funds maintained church operations. Spain's tribunal, though, became a self-funding arm of the state. Records from 1580 show the Valencia tribunal sending 60% of seized assets directly to Madrid, enough to finance 2 galleys for the Armada. While the Pope's inquisitors worried about souls, Spain's worried about silver. The divergences grew starker in the colonies. When the Roman Inquisition pursued heresy in Italy, its reach stopped at the coastline. Spain's tribunals, however, sailed to Mexico and Peru, becoming tools of imperial control. Indigenous leaders resisting forced labor weren't accused of paganism. They were framed as Judaizers, a charge so absurd it revealed the system's flexibility. Heresy became whatever threatened Spanish dominance, whether in Flanders or the Andes. These contrasts expose Spain's real innovation. Other inquisitions were scalpels, cutting out theological infections. Spain's was a hammer, reforging society itself, one terrified confession at a time. Where Rome sought to correct belief, Madrid craved control. proving that the most dangerous inquisition isn't the one that burns books, but the one that rewrites history. The Spanish Inquisition's shadow stretches far beyond the archives and ash-filled pits of history. It lingers in our collective imagination, warped by centuries of retelling into a caricature of itself. Hollywood loves a good hooded villain, and few historical institutions fit the bill as neatly as the tribunal. From Monty Python's infamous sketch where the mere mention of the Inquisition sends characters scrambling, to video games like Assassin's Creed, where inquisitors lurk in every shadow, the stereotype is clear: an all-powerful, omniscient force of fanatical cruelty. But these portrayals often strip away the nuance, reducing a sprawling, centuries-long system into a single note of mustache-twirling evil. The irony is rich. The very institution that once controlled narratives through censorship and fear now finds its own story twisted beyond recognition. Take the myth of the Inquisition's omnipresence. Pop culture would have you believe that no one expected the Spanish Inquisition, but in reality, its tribunals were public spectacles, their arrivals announced weeks in advance. Trials dragged on for months, sometimes years, with meticulous paperwork that would bore any screenwriter to tears. The real horror wasn't in surprise raids, it was in the agonizing anticipation, the slow grind of bureaucracy weaponized to break wills. Even the iconic imagery is misleading. Those pointed hoods, they were originally worn by the penitents the accused forced to don them as symbols of shame, not the inquisitors themselves, who dressed like any other church officials. The auto-da-fé's fiery climax, so vividly depicted in films, often featured far more ritual than actual executions. Yet these distortions persist because they serve a narrative purpose. The Inquisition makes a perfect shorthand for unchecked authority, a historical bogeyman we can all agree to condemn. But the deeper legacy isn't in the caricatures, it's in how the Inquisition shaped the very language of oppression. Modern terms like witch hunt or thought police trace their lineage back to its tactics. George Orwell's 1984 borrowed its playbook. The concept of unpersons, erased from records, mirrors the Inquisition's meticulous excision of heretics from communal memory. Even today's debates over censorship and surveillance echo its methods. When social media algorithms flag dangerous content or governments monitor dissent, the ghost of the tribunal whispers in the machinery, not because these systems are identical, but because the Inquisition wrote the first draft on how to police belief. Perhaps the most enduring misconception is the idea that the Inquisition was a uniquely Spanish evil. This ignores how eagerly other European powers adopted its methods when convenient. England's persecution of Catholics under Elizabeth I, or the Salem witch trials, shared the same DNA, scapegoating minorities under the guise of moral purity. Yet Spain alone bears the brand, a testament to how effectively its enemies, from Protestant pamphleteers to Enlightenment philosophers, turned the tribunal into a symbol of everything wrong with absolute power. The truth is, the Inquisition's cultural afterlife matters precisely because it's been flattened into a lesson. We've made it a parable about religious fanaticism, ignoring its lessons about how institutions corrupt, how fear is monetized, and how systems of control outlive their creators. When we reduce it to a Halloween costume of hoods and heresy, we miss the chance to ask the harder questions about who holds the power to define truth and what happens when that power goes unchecked. The Inquisition isn't just a relic, it's a mirror, and what stares back at us isn't a medieval monster, but the unsettling reflection of how easily justice can become just another word for control. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't just about faith, it was a masterclass in how power disguises itself as piety. Behind the screams of the tortured and the smoke of the autos-da-fé, we've uncovered a tapestry of hidden agendas, monarchs consolidating control by inventing enemies, bureaucrats lining their pockets with confiscated gold, and entire societies reshaped through the alchemy of fear. But the most chilling revelation isn't the brutality, it's the blueprint. This wasn't chaos, it was a system meticulously designed to turn ideology into a weapon where every accusation served a purpose beyond salvation. Consider the pattern. First, identify a scapegoat: conversos, moriscos, healers, anyone outside the circle of power. Next, criminalize their existence under the guise of moral purity. Then, monetize their persecution, whether through seized estates or forced tributes. Finally, make the terror self-sustaining: neighbors denouncing neighbors, children inheriting their parents' stigma, until the machine no longer needed kings to turn the crank. The Inquisition's genius wasn't in its cruelty, but in its efficiency. It taught us that oppression works best when wrapped in a flag or a cross, when the oppressed are made complicit in their own chains. And yet, the echoes linger. Modern demagogues still conjure boogeymen to justify surveillance states. Corporations peddle algorithms that reward outrage, turning distrust into a commodity. Even our own clicks and shares can become unwitting tools in systems that profit from division. The question isn't whether history repeats itself, it's whether we recognize the patterns when they wear new masks. So here's where we turn to you. Where do you see the Inquisition's fingerprints today? In border walls built on manufactured panic, in laws that police bodies under the guise of virtue. Or perhaps in subtler ways, the quiet erosion of trust, the normalization of suspicion. The comments are open and the conversation is urgent, because the lesson of the Inquisition isn't just about the past. It's a warning about how easily fear can be weaponized and how quickly justice can become just another word for control. The fires may have died centuries ago, but the shadows they cast still stretch long.